welcome to another episode of
The Crafting Slab.
Today we're going to be learning about the case of Ruth Ellis, who was the last woman to be hanged for murder in the UK in 1955.
And we're going to be doing some pyrography. This is what we're going to be doing, so it's a little pyrography feather.
In theme with our first video where we did a lino print feather. So if you're interested in lino print, you want to see that video, you can go back to our episode 1 and watch that one. So let's see what we need for the pyrography.
Let's get started. Right, so these are the bits you're going to need for the pyrography work. We talk about safety first. So I've got my mask here. So this stops me inhaling the smoke. There's also, you can have extractor fans, which is this one, and that draws the smoke away from you. So ideally have both or one or the other.
Would it be best to do the work outside if possible?
You can do the work outside, but remember you've got to have a power supply, so whatever is easiest. Next to an open window is good, but again, even if you're next to an open window, it's probably best to have the mask too. Then the wood, so obviously you're going to need some wood to burn on. You have to watch out what kind of wood you use, so I wouldn't use things like MDF because that's stuck together with glue and you could potentially be breathing in the glue fumes. And also woods like yew is toxic to burn on, so just be mindful of what woods you're using. This is just plywood from a hobby store. Okay, so once you've got your wood, you need to prepare it. So it would need to be sanded. I go from a coarse grit sandpaper to a fine grit sandpaper. So, and I gradually build up the grit. So start at maybe 80 or 100 grit. And then I often then go to like 300 grit, 600 grit, and I normally finish at about 1,000 grit sandpaper. So you want it like super, super smooth, like glass smooth, and that makes it easier to burn on and also gives a better finish when you're burning, so you don't get all the little bumps in it.
Is there any way you can buy the wood pre-prepared?
You can buy the wood pre-prepared, but that would often cost more money, and you would have to go to somewhere that does it. For example, this is already pretty smooth from the shop, but it's not pyrography smooth. So even though this wasn't rough when I bought it, I still sanded it with a fine grit sandpaper to get it smooth. So next we'll have a look at the different types of pyrography machines. This is a basic pyrography machine, costs about £10 from a craft shop, and it's a metal solid tip one. This is a wire tip machine. This costs around £160, £170 plus the cost of pens and things on top. And this gives I think it gives a more detailed pyrography line. You can buy different pens to go in it. I've got the interchangeable pen, so I buy different wire tips and I can just change the wire tips.
How much would the simple tool be from the hobby shop?
This one?
Yes.
This is about £10. Okay. So depends what you want to spend. There's more expensive machines and slightly cheaper machines, but generally you're looking at over £100 for a proper wire tip machine. And finally, to finish it, like any art, pyrography is likely to fade over time. To try and keep it for as long as possible, you'd want to varnish it. So I use a yacht varnish. So that's for outdoor use, but it would make it last a bit longer. And what I normally do is do a few sprays with this yacht varnish, and then I'd paint another varnish on top just to try and keep it for as long as possible.
And could you seal it with resin?
Yeah, so I've done different methods of sealing it, and yeah, and an epoxy resin can be used, and that gives a really, really good effect. But it is a little bit more complicated to use because obviously you've got to mix it right and not get the bubbles in it and everything. So this one's easier, but I also love epoxy resin. Okay, so I've just quickly sketched out a feather on this piece of wood here. There are other methods you can use. So you can print off a design and transfer it using transfer paper. This is the one I use. It's Sorel transfer paper. And you can get different types of it, but you can also just scribble on the back with a pencil and transfer it that way. That's a cheaper method, but perhaps takes a little bit longer. Or you can draw a design onto paper first if you don't want to draw directly onto wood, and then transfer it. Okay, so I will start with the burning, and just so you know, with this machine, there's different temperature settings. So I've got it around in the middle, and I'll probably keep it around that for this, but you can turn it down if you just want to burn lightly, and turn it up if you want to do darker burns.
So that would be for details.
Yeah.
Okay.
So over to you, Becky.
Okay, so while you're starting your burning, I'll start on the story of Ruth Ellis. She was born Ruth Nielsen in 1926 and in Rhyl in Wales, and she moved to Basingstoke in Hampshire when she was quite young. She left school at 14 and began working at various London nightclubs, and with that came the whirlwind romances of young men. She began a relationship with a married Canadian soldier at the age of 17 and became pregnant. The father was in contact with her for a while, but then moved back to Canada. And when the child was 1, he stopped sending money. So that meant she had to go and move back home with her mother and father in order to support the child, who was named Andy. She was quite popular in the nightclubs, and her first job was working for Maurice Connolly at the Court Club in Duke Street, London, which was a very famous club at the time. And he used to blackmail his hostesses into sleeping with him. So, for example, if they had had a backstreet abortion, he would know about it, he would help them with it, and then he would use it to blackmail them into either sleeping with them. Either he would sleep with them, or he would sort of sell them off to his friends. So he was a really lovely man. When she was working as a hostess, it came with a lot of expectations above and beyond serving drinks, basically. And she would have to perform for the clients in the nightclub. By 1950, she was involved as an escort and became pregnant again by one of her clients. She had one of Maurice Connolly's famed backstreet abortions in the 3rd month of her pregnancy, which was illegal at the time. And so it probably came with a lot of risk to her health and a lot of pain and unnecessary suffering, because she was then expected to go straight back to work. On the 8th of November 1950, so she was born in 1926, so she was 24. Ruth married a dentist called George Ellis, who was a regular customer at the Court Club. He was another charming man, violent, possessive, alcoholic, who constantly accused her of having an affair, to the point that when their daughter Georgina was born, he refused to accept that she was his. And that led to their separation and eventual divorce. Again, Ruth moved back in with her mother and father, with her daughter. And their son Andy had remained with Ruth's parents when she married George, and Ruth would send money to support him. In 1953, Ruth got a job as the manager of the Little Club in Knightsbridge, another famous club in the 50s. She was very popular and had admirers and celebrity friends who'd lavish her with gifts and favours. And it was through one of those famous clients, through racing driver Mike Hawthorne, who I am told was a very famous racing driver at the time. Don't know a lot about him. Probably find out a lot about him through the.
I don't know much about racing.
No,
drivers.
neither do I. So apologies for that. But she met a man called David Blakely, who was a former public school boy educated at Sandhurst, but he was also a racing fanatic and a hard drinker. Within weeks of them meeting, Blakely had moved into the Ruth's flat above the club, despite being engaged to another woman. And he carried on seeing this woman and Ruth had other relationships as well. So it was a fairly tumultuous relationship. Ruth became pregnant for a 4th time. Although Blakely doted on her, she didn't feel the same, and so she terminated the pregnancy in another dangerous backstreet abortion. And after that, although she remained with Blakely, she began seeing a man called Desmond Cousin, who was a former Lancaster bomber pilot in the Second World War. She eventually moved in with Cousins, keeping Blakely on the side, although the relationship had become increasingly violent as they continued to see other people and became more and more jealous of one another. Despite all of this, Ruth agreed to marry Blakely. So she was living with Desmond Cousins, but decided she was going to marry this other guy. However, it never happened because in 1955, Ruth suffered a miscarriage after Blakely punched her in the stomach after another argument.
No.
So she had, so by this point, she had had one pregnancy, which resulted in her child, Andy. No, her first was an abortion, then it was Andy, then another abortion, then Georgina, then another abortion, and then this fifth pregnancy, which resulted in a miscarriage.
Wow.
So that left her very shocked and upset, and she was still incredibly young to have gone through all of this. On Easter Sunday, April 10th, 1955, Ruth took a taxi to Anthony and Carol Findlater's house, who was a mutual friend of theirs, and she was specifically looking for Blakely, and she thought he might be staying there. As she drove up, she saw, as the taxi drove up, she saw Blakely's car drive off. So she stated that she followed him on foot to the Magdala pub in South Hill Park, which was another regular haunt of theirs. Ruth waited for Blakely to come out of the pub. He was in there for a long time and she was waiting for him. And at around 9:30 p.m, she stepped out of a doorway as Blakely passed and she fired at him from a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. The first shot missed him, so she fired again as Blakely ran and took cover behind the car. This one struck him and he fell to the pavement, where she fired another 3 shots, killing Blakely as he begged her to stop. She then reportedly continued to fire, the 6th bullet missing, and bystanders hearing the chamber click round. So it was clicking the rounds, but it had no bullets in it. And I think that shows that she was just desperate to kill him, desperate to put as many bullets in him as she could.
Well, it sounds like she just was crazed.
Yeah, it sounds like something out of a horror movie where, you know, the final girl shoots and shoots and shoots. Blakely's friend, Clive Gunnell, who he'd been with at the pub, had witnessed the entire thing. And after killing Blakely, Ruth was reportedly calm and cold. And she turned to him and said, "Will you call the police, Clive?" Because she was a bit confused, she didn't know what to do. So she was immediately arrested, and she was apparently heard to say, "I'm guilty, I'm a little confused." And she appeared lucid. There was no sign of mental illness or any drugs or alcohol in her system. She was just really wanted to kill this man. She really wanted him to die.
But I don't know, the fact that she was just so calm and said to call the police and everything does sound like she had mental problems.
Yeah, she wasn't upset by what had happened. Apparently, according to
what year was this?
1955.
Okay.
So the following day, Ruth was ordered to remain on remand, and her trial, because it was such a huge case in the media, they wanted to basically fast track her trial, and so it happened in April, and her trial began in June of that year. So they were obviously keen to convict her.
Yeah.
She was only 29 years old at the time.
Wow.
And when she appeared in court, she was wearing a black suit with a white blouse and had big blonde curled hair. And reportedly she was calm and made no attempt to hide what she had done. Ruth was asked, "When you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intend to do?" And she replied, "It's obvious. When I shot him, I intended to kill him." And her answer, which secured her conviction, and mandatory death sentence. And the jury only took 20 minutes to convict her. after her conviction, Ruth's family launched a campaign for a reprieve from the death penalty, but Ruth had stated over and over again that she wanted no part in it. She didn't want to be pardoned. She didn't want her sentence commuted or anything like that. She'd come to accept what was going to happen. Yeah, to her. And she'd accepted it, but she was reportedly very calm. She wasn't, prone to fits of anger or anything like that. She just stayed calm her entire time in prison. And she'd lived a life of violence and fear and pain. And at 29, I think she was just ready for it to end.
Yeah.
On July the 12th, 1955, the day before her execution, Ruth divulged to her solicitor that Desmond Cousins had actually given her the gun and taught her how to use it the week before the murder. She also said that her story about getting a taxi and then following Blakely wasn't true, that he had actually dropped her off. They'd followed him and he dropped her off. And he asked for this information not to be used to delay her execution. She was just ready for it to end. And then she wrote a letter to Blakely's parents later that day stating, "I have always loved your son and shall die still loving him." Their relationship was really messed up.
To say the least. Yeah.
After it was a very, very short term, she was arrested. She committed the crime 10th of April, and on the 15th of July, just referring to my notes, on the 20th of June, so 2 months later, her execution was set, and she was executed by hanging at 9:30 on July 13th. 20th of June was her conviction date. 13th of July was the date that she died, so 3 months.
But yeah, even so, that
would never happen
quick
these days.
Well, you wouldn't hang someone these days, but no. The process wouldn't go through that quickly, definitely.
And I think part of the reason was that it was such a huge case. It wasn't really seen. Women as cold-bloodedly murdering people, so it would seem. So 9:30 on the 13th of July 1955, she was executed at Holloway Prison, and along with all of the other women that were executed or died at the prison, she was buried in an unmarked grave inside the grounds. At some point in the early 1970s, though, her remains, along with all of the other women within the walls of Holloway Prison, were moved and returned to their families, and many of their graves marked. And Ruth was one of those. She was moved to St Mary's Church in Amersham and had a headstone erected, but it was a really simple inscription on the headstone. It just says Ruth Hornby, 1926 to 1955. So there's no mention of.
I think that's good that they moved the remains and they got headstones, because it doesn't matter to the person who's died where they're buried. No. It's more to do with the family, and it wasn't her family that committed the crime.
And they say, don't they, death is a great equalizer. We're all the same in death. Doesn't it like you say, it no longer matters to her what she's done.
Yeah.
But it obviously mattered to her family, because they were fighting to have her for a reprieve from the death sentence. Anyway, so her inscription was really simple, and although apparently friends and family did keep the grave and visit it, her son Andy destroyed her headstone in 1982, just before he committed suicide.
Oh.
So he was 10 at the time of her execution.
Oh, how hard has that got to be?
So I think he would probably have understood everything that was going on. He was living with his grandparents, so he was right in the thick of it. And reportedly, the trial judge, the judge who had...
even for an adult to have a parent executed is a traumatic experience. For a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
Can't even imagine.
No, and the fact that he would have remembered everything.
Yeah.
So apparently the trial judge had been sending money every year to support Andy.
Oh, really?
And I think it was the prosecutor had paid for Ruth's funeral. So paid to have her headstone and everything done. Which again must have just captured the imagination of the public.
Yeah, that can't have been something that they did a lot of.
No. Ruth's daughter Georgina was only 3 at the time. It's a very tragic family history, because 3 years after Ruth was executed, her father George hanged himself.
Oh my goodness.
So she was placed in foster care. It's a really bleak family history.
It's heartbreaking.
So Ruth's campaign for a pardon was still in progress as recent as 2003, on the basis that she had been the victim of domestic violence, and it was it's not an excuse for what she did, but it is a reason. But in 2003, her case for a pardon was rejected by the Court of Appeal. And this case and Ruth's life has just continued to capture the British people's imagination.
Was there any information on why it was rejected?
Because I think part of the reason is because of her own testimony and how she appeared at the time.
I guess so.
She didn't put in an appeal at the time because she didn't want to.
Yeah.
And even though her family were fighting on her behalf, she was completely accepting of her sentence and what had to be done. I think, looking at her life, bearing in mind she left school at 14, by 29, living that life of being sold to different men, all the hectic nature of the relationships that she had, the life that she lived, she must have been exhausted. She must have been physically and mentally exhausted. Everything that had happened to her body, the effect that abortions and miscarriages and pregnancies has on you. To have had 5 pregnancies by 29, that's got to have taken a toll on her body. But she, unfortunately, the only thing she'll be remembered for is the fact that she was the last female to be put to death in the UK. That's her legacy. And it's quite a sad legacy, really.
It is sad, given her sad life. I mean, obviously, no one should kill other people, obviously, but for her to have lived such a terribly sad life, and then that's following on from that sad life to then be carried on to her children. Yeah, exactly. And it is. There's a whole section in one of the articles that I read about her tragic family history. There was reports that her sister was abused by her father and that she escaped the abuse, and that's why she wanted to get out of the house as quickly as possible. That her mum knew that the abuse was happening, and it is that cycle of abuse, isn't it? So she obviously wanted something better for herself and tried her best to go about it the only way she knew how. But getting into that, the 1950s life of hostesses in nightclubs wasn't a nice place to be. It seemed to be a jolly old romp for the men. They, if you see in documentaries and films and things, all the men seem to be having a wonderful time in the 1950s. Yeah, not the women so much.
And obviously that it was the post-war era as well. So, my mum was born in 1952 and they still had rationing. So people were still going without, but they wanted to, the country was on the up and up, and they wanted more for themselves. But unfortunately, with Ruth, she didn't get it. And I've looked into her burial place, and there hasn't been another headstone erected, and I also haven't been able to find the number of the plot. A friend of mine lives near Amersham, and I asked her, was there anything? Did she know anything about it? Had she heard anything about it? And her mum remembers, the uproar when her body was buried in Amersham, because it was, they were like, oh, we don't want a murderess being buried in our church. But the church had, without reservation, agreed to bury her there. So when her remains were exhumed, there was no hesitation on the church's part. They were asked, can we bury this person here? And they said yes. They paid for their plot, and that was it. But apparently the residents took great umbrage to the fact that they had a murderess buried in their midst.
I mean, unless there's some kind of zombie uprising where the dead start coming to life, I don't think she's going to be causing them many problems.
No, exactly.
But it's all very, you know, NIMBY, not in my backyard, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I've never heard that phrase before. Yeah, exactly. And the fact that things weren't talked about, but, you know, you didn't talk about things within your family, but everybody was talking about it, you know, all the gossip that happened within those small communities. It's quite sad, really, that even, I know she shouldn't have done what she did. It's not an excuse. And we're not promoting murder on this channel, by the way. We should never ever murder anyone ever. But
murder's bad, okay?
Yes. But you can understand why she
had enough.
Why she'd had enough. And then to just resign yourself to execution. I can't imagine going to my execution calmly, just walking up to the gallows.
And I mean, they say there was no sign of mental health problems or anything like that, but in the 1950s, there wasn't the same acceptance of, you know, depression and things like that that there is now.
I think she said she was confused when she was arrested. So likelihood now was that she, you know, they'd say something like she had a psychotic break.
Yeah.
Because
post-traumatic stress syndrome from, you know, the abuse that she suffered.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I couldn't find a lot of information on how Desmond Cousins came into it, because I know that he had given her the gun, and I would have liked to have known, you know, if it was something to do with him, if there was any coercion, you know, if he had tried to encourage her to kill him, to get him out of the picture, because the relationships, her relationships, and it seemed like a few people who were in the club scene at the time had a terrible amount of jealousy, and maybe he was more involved than what he would admit. But she'd already been convicted, so I don't think there was any reason to chase him for another conviction. Yeah, so that's the sad life and times of Ruth Ellis.
Another very sad case.
A very sad case. Maybe next time we'll do a case where someone really got what they deserved.
I don't think there's many happy true crime stories.
No, unfortunately not. This does it feels like one of the most tragic cases I've ever read about. Now, obviously every death is tragic, but her story is so complicated, and she was so young. Yeah, she really captured the British imagination. There's been loads of, you know, after the case, there was lots of TV and film adaptations, and it's really interesting to see how the public really grabbed onto this case in particular. I wonder if it was one of the reasons that the capital punishment was abolished in the UK. I don't know if there was if they were planning to abolish it before that. But yeah, she is definitely an interesting woman.
I hope you enjoyed Becky's story. I found it really interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating life and times with Ruth Ellis. She really is interesting. You should definitely look into her more if you found the story engaging. And here's Danielle's finished.
This is the finished piece. This is the feather. There are other bits that I will show you. I was really excited to be able to do pyrography today, because pyrography is my thing that I do. I do a lot of pet portraits for people. So these are a few other examples of different bits of wood. So we've got a deer. There's the same type of wood as the feather, but with a dog on it. Little hanging decoration there. And also a little freestanding stump that's really cute.
I don't know if you can see on this one, you can see how the pen, you can use the different heat settings from the pen. So obviously here, she's used the darker, hotter setting to create these dark lines, and then the fine, each tiny individual hair has been burnt in.
And if you want to have a look at any more of the pyrography work, there's quite a few on my social media pages, which is Danielle Light Art.
We'll leave the link in the description, and we'll also leave the link to Danielle's Etsy shop where you can buy some of these beautiful pieces of work, or you can get a commission of your own. So thank you very much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thanks. Bye.